Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Art of Dying Well podcast of 2022. What a blur these last few years have been, I have to say. Now, it seems like we're sort of edging out into the light from the pandemic, much as it's not gone away, of course. And we're socialising a bit more, speaking to each other a bit more, listening a little bit more, perhaps. But can we remember how to listen and process properly? Or are we maybe a little bit rusty? Now, that's why I was going to call this particular art of dying well the art of listening well, or maybe perhaps the art of conversing well. And that's what we want to look at today. Breaking bad news, consoling people, exploring feelings and emotions, having those meaningful, tender conversations in the face of challenging circumstances. That's really what we're about for the next hour or so. And I'm delighted to say that our first guest has been on this podcast before, her third appearance, no less. And that's the gem, the delight, the wonderful Dr. Kathryn Mannix. Kathryn, what a total joy. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel like I'm a serial offender. I'm very fine and I'm delighted to be talking to you again. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, as you can tell, I'm rather enthusiastic about it. A palliative care specialist, we've mentioned that several times. Cognitive behaviour therapist. I didn't know that, actually. I read that on the sleeve of the book that we're going to talk about, and I didn't know that. Now, you've spent thousands of hours, as we've said many times, helping at the bedsides of thousands of people. But now you're a world-famous author, I would say, helping all of us with your books. And we're going to talk about... I'll hold it up for the camera for those watching this. Listen. Excellent book. How to Find Words for Tender Conversations. Now, we've talked about your first book in the past, With the End in Mind, which is an excellent book, I have to say. And I'll have a little story about that a little bit later on. But in this, it's the sort of, well, you tell a lot of stories. We talk about the common element of a conversation needing to be a collaboration. So I'm going to throw one at you, actually, fresh from your book. This is using your own information at you here. In the getting started section, I'm going to say, where would you like to start?
Okay, that's rather lovely. One of the things that I realised once people started writing to me about the first book, which was intended to be the only book, that was it, because I didn't think I was a writer. I thought I was a doctor who wrote a book, which is not the same thing. And I got lots and lots of letters from people saying, "You convinced us we need to talk about this stuff, but I don't know how to start. My family won't let me. I'm really worried that if I open it up, we'll never go back to normal again." You know, all those things about a daunting conversation that make it something you don't know how to start. And a lot of it was about I don't know how to start, or I don't know what to say. So I then started to realise that even though I had no intention of writing another book, I did know an awful lot about these conversations and how to get in gently and how to stay alongside soothingly and how to finish safely. And maybe I could write about that. But the tone of the letters was all about what to say or how to start. And it seemed to me that what people thought needed to happen was that the other person needed to be given a really good talking to. And as I stopped to really think, well, what does happen when we're having those conversations? You know, going back through not just my palliative care practice now, but my cognitive therapy practice, or just, you know, being a mum or managing a service or helping trainees who are feeling their way into their training or whatever. Almost all of those really important conversations are mainly listening. It's giving somebody a really good listening to. And the best way in is not to suddenly plonk down in front of them and say, right, we're going to talk about this. It's to give them the option of whether they'd like to talk about it or not. So I think, as you just did, the way in that we don't really think about, but when things go well, is usually what we've done is we've done it by mutual consent, which means that at some point we've given an invitation.
Yeah. Now that leads me, it might seem like an obvious question, but it's something that I think long before I read your book, actually, I've been a bit preoccupied with, and that's the difference between hearing and listening. We can all hear things. We hear things going on around us all the time, don't we? And what your book sort of proved to me and illustrated very well in these lovely stories, as well as your brilliant words, was that actually that's quite a fundamental difference. You know, actually listening involves some processing and understanding, perhaps, if that's the right word. How would you describe the difference between hearing and listening?
I think it's interesting how we use language, even, because I think we use hearing in two different ways. So we use hearing to talk about the processing of noise, to work out what it is that's coming into our ears and arriving in our brain. But we also say when we've really identified with somebody that we've been listening to and their story, we might often say, "Yes, I hear you." Or they might say, "I felt really heard." And maybe it's the same thing. It's that we are taking what they're saying and asking them to expand on it or reflecting with them on it, so that eventually it isn't just the individual things that we've listened to, it's the whole scenario that they find themselves in that we have heard. And perhaps more importantly than we have heard it, by saying it aloud, they've been able to listen to it too and pull all the different bits that are all over the place in a complicated situation they find themselves in, kind of put it together a bit like, when you've smashed a mirror and you're trying to make sure you've got all the shards, or it's like a scattered jigsaw and they're trying to assemble the pieces. So listening is, maybe that's the process of making sure that we're following the track that's important to them, not the track that's important to us.
Ah, that's interesting.
And then hearing, maybe we show we've heard by going back to say, "I think what I've heard you say so far is this," and then giving it back in a way that helps them to say, "Oh yeah," or "Oh no, that's rubbish. Hang on, need to go back over that again." Yeah.
Now, you've helped me there, because I think I'd formed this opinion that one of them was superficial and one of them was in depth. But actually, from what you've just said, that's not really true, because you can hear in a more in depth, less superficial way, and you can listen in a more in depth way as well. So that's absolutely fascinating. So I think I'll ask next, what is good listening or good hearing?
What's good listening is actually in the eye of the speaker, isn't it? It's how well does the speaker feel listened to? And we know there are some things that help people to feel listened to or stop people from feeling listened to. So when you're trying to tell somebody something and they change the subject, that you're not being listened to. Or you try to tell somebody something and they say, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Now, when I was 17," and they tell you their story that they think is exactly like your story. Of course, it's nothing like your story at all. So that's somebody who's really trying to join in, but they've turned it into it being about them. So I guess the hallmarks of really good listening are that it stays centered on either the subject that you've both agreed you're going to talk about, or the dilemma that the person being listened to is trying to explore and find ways through. And the listener doesn't talk very much because they're listening, and uses their curiosity to just keep checking back. Have I really understood this? Is there any other bit of this that I've left out that I haven't asked you about? Summarizing back. And sometimes when you hear somebody summarizing back, it gives you an insight you hadn't had before. Even when they've summarized back wrong, you realize what's right by noticing what they didn't get right. So
So there's
gradually,
some value in that, actually, in not maybe listening or hearing correctly. There's still some value in it getting you to the right place in the end, maybe.
absolutely. So if you think about it as a process, the conversation is a shared endeavor, isn't it? And if I'm listening to you and you're describing your dilemma, your difficult situation, you're wondering about whether to do this thing at work or have this conversation with a member of your family, whatever it is, if I'm there as your supporter and we trust each other, I should be able to say to you, so is it about this aspect of it then, James? And for you to be able to think, is it? Oh yeah, partly it is. Or to be able to say, no, actually, it isn't. Okay, that's a bit of clarity. It isn't about that. So what is it about? And it's not like the helper got something wrong, because it isn't about being right and wrong. It's about being curious. And for children, who are the role models for curiosity, anything is possible. So they ask tons and tons of questions, and we give them information, and they gradually work out how stuff is, and they start to understand the world, and they classify things. We're doing that. We're being a curious listener. And if we ask a question that isn't a particularly helpful question, that's okay, because there are other questions we can ask too.
Do you know what I find fascinating about the book? And I think maybe when we all read books and we're all sort of maybe trying to glean whatever we can so we can improve how we tackle certain things, such as a sensitive, challenging conversation, you sort of think to yourself, oh, must remember that. That's really good. That will help me. Oh, must remember that. Must remember that. And then it actually happens, and you sort of find your brain going almost like a flow chart inside, going, okay, I need to go from this to this to this. Did I hear properly there? Did I do this? Did I respond in the right way? Can it get a little bit robotic like that, or systematic rather than human? How do you sort of, it's quite a dilemma, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you want to respond in a human way. And in the other hand, as I did, I've read the book and thought, okay, I need to be doing these things. How do you keep those things in mind that will help you, whereas not appearing like a robot when you want to appear like a human?
That's a brilliant, brilliant question. So when I was starting to think about how to frame the different skills that we use, my original metaphor was that it was like a toolkit. I was going to make the book like a toolkit. And then as I was starting to develop it, I realized that doesn't quite work, because with a toolkit, you pick up one tool and you use it, and then you put it down to pick up the next tool to do the next thing. And that isn't what's happening in a conversation, because you're going to carry on listening. You're going to carry on being interested. You're going to carry on being kind. And sometimes you're going to ask a question. Sometimes you're going to make a summary. Sometimes you're going to go back to something that you said a few minutes ago, because actually, when you said that before, I thought you meant this, but now I'm thinking about, so you're really showing that you're paying attention by going backwards and forwards in the conversation. And I realized actually dancing is a much better metaphor. And when you're learning to dance, or you're learning to ride a bike, you're trying to keep all of the things in your head at the same time, of moving to the rhythm, or pointing the handlebars in the right direction and not stopping pedaling even though you feel yourself wobble, that kind of thing. I like the dance metaphor because if you think about ballroom dancing or something like that, it involves two people. And we're both doing our best, and we're both working together, and the dance is the collaboration between us. Yeah, and we're both trying not to trip each other up and not to tread on each other's toes, but we might even fall over, but we'll both know that was an accident, and we'll help each other to get up and dust each other down and get on with it again. So dancing is a really rich metaphor. So thinking about your kind of clunky, am I doing step A and then step B? Well, that is how it feels when you're learning to dance. Left foot, right foot. It's slow, slow, quick, quick, slow. But eventually what happens is you've done it enough times that you trust yourself. And in listening, I think you've done it enough times that you just trust that going in with a good intention, maintaining a focus on what the person wants to talk about, and simply collaborating, being curious, offering back what you've heard so far so that you've checked it out, and not getting in the way by giving advice or giving reassurance, which feels like the right thing to do, but actually just, that's what we think rather than what they've thought of. if we just trust that that is essentially the thing to do, we can stop thinking about the algorithm and we can just go with the flow in the same way as we will sway with the rhythm of the music and we'll move in time to the music, and then eventually we'll use the correct foot in the correct sequence. But if you use the wrong foot first, hey, you're still moving with the music, you're still dancing.
Yeah, I think using the wrong foot 3/4 of the way in isn't quite so bad. I don't know if you've had this, I certainly have, where you know it's a tough conversation, you're having it, and then you start to do the terrible thing of slightly patting yourself on the back because it's going quite well. Have you ever done that? And I'm thinking, wow, not to be the hero, but goodness me, I'm quite pleased. I was dreading this and it's going okay. And then you say something either dumb or, this is like the metaphor, I suppose. You then tread on their toe. It's going great. You're swaying nicely. You tread on their toe. And then you have that recovery process where you're like, oh, no, didn't mean that. And they look at you, then you suddenly realize you've got it all wrong. The misstep, I suppose. But can you recover from a misstep halfway through?
And I think you can. I think once we've established that what we're here to do is support each other, then after that it's okay to get things wrong because the intention is kind, the intention is good, the intention is worthy, and the other person knows that. And so to be able to actually have the courage to say, you know what, that just came out of my mouth all wrong, or that didn't sound like that in my head. I'm sorry, that sounds really clumsy. That sounded really insensitive. Can I say that a different way? Can I cross that out altogether? And
because they can see you backpedaling, can't they? They know full well you're backpedaling on the direction you went in with that.
Yeah, and so when it's with a friend or a person in your family who you already have a good relationship with anyway, to just get out of your own head that you're not going to destroy your lifelong relationship by saying one inept thing during this important conversation. But if it's a professional conversation, perhaps we feel a little bit more anxious. You're meeting somebody for the first time and you're having to deal with telling them, really unwelcome news about, how knackered their car is and how much money it's going to cost to fix it, or, the bad result of their recent health tests and what it might mean, whatever it is. We might say something that they're not quite ready to hear yet. And it's the truth, but we haven't softened the path to that place adequately. And it feels like a slap to them. But we can see that that's happened. And Sam, I'm really sorry. I can see that's really shocked you. Or I can see you weren't ready to hear that. I'm really sorry. And then, perhaps the most important step of all is the being with somebody in their distress because they just need a companion while they quietly take that in. So knowing when to stop talking and be present alongside somebody who is just actually taking in that replacing the rear springs on their car is going to cost more money than they've actually got in the bank account. But if they don't do that, they can't do the school run. Or actually, these blood tests suggest now that you need to have some scans. And yes, we are looking for a really serious illness on these scans. There isn't a way of making that kind of bad news better news. We just have to be alongside somebody while they just take that in and work out how they're going to deal with it.
Well, I think we'll come on to silence because you mentioned silence in the book a fair bit as well. But on a similar level, let's pick up on what you've just said, actually, and talk about when words fail you a little bit. Silence can be something one can do, of course. Actions speak louder than words. How often have we heard that particular phrase used? Now, I'm going to talk about your previous book, but only for a little bit of context. I've got a very dear friend of mine and his lovely family, and their son was diagnosed with cancer when he was mid-teens, very young. Went into remission. It all looked okay. And then, as these things sometimes do, tragically, came back when he turned 20 and then very quickly deteriorated. And, I present this podcast. I thought to myself I would be able to speak to my friend, who I obviously know very well. We've broached many, many subjects over many, many years with one another. And I found myself, literally, the words failed me. I didn't know what to do. I shocked myself, actually, by not knowing what to do. And you, without knowing it, actually came to the rescue. I don't know if it was because I was quite desperate at that point and thought, well, what do? I don't have the words. I thought I would have, and I don't. I saw your book. I was literally just thinking about what I might say next time I saw him, or what if I give him a call, what am I going to say? Or if I go around and see him, what am I going to say? And I saw your book and I thought, well, actually, I got a lot of wisdom out of that. I found it quite consoling as well. And I wonder if he might feel the same. So I remember when I was waiting around at his place, because I was trying to help out in some small way when his son was coming home. I just took the cover off because I didn't want the big words with the end in mind to be too alarming. And I just popped it on the third shelf up in this particular room I was in, and then gently directed him to it via a message. And sometime later, his son sadly died. It was a real tragedy. Broke us all up, really. He said, well, actually, the book really helped me during those precious final moments. And I believe others in the family too. So I sort of wanted to bring that up because words failed me, and I was able to use the book your first book, to actually help. And he said it was very, very helpful. I didn't know how it would help, if it would help, to what extent it would help, but it certainly did that. So I guess sometimes when words fail you, you can use the words of others, can't you?
Yeah, that's a lovely story. Thank you for telling me that. And yeah, we do get stuck, don't we? Even those of us who it is our life's work to be engaged in conversations that can be very, very emotionally charged with strangers, with people who are not our friends and family. Somehow it's different when they are our people. It feels different, doesn't it? It absolutely does. And I do think that it's okay to say, I don't know what to say. I'm just going to sit here and be with you for as long as that's going to be helpful. But I've got nothing here. And that actually that task of just saying, I don't know what I can do that will help, but I'm prepared to be here in the dark with you. I think that's a really important part of the tenderness in these conversations. And Brene Brown talks about this absolutely beautifully. The idea of the people who come along to try to help by pointing out to you that at least it's not as bad as this, and at least it's not as bad as that. Or they come along and they have you thought of, and they make all of their suggestions. And of course, if it was as simple as any of those suggestions that I can think of, you would have solved it by now. So sometimes all we can do is sit in the dark beside you and say, this is really hard, isn't it? Here I am.
Yeah. And that actually was, I think that's the way. That's the way when words fail you. So let's talk about silence then, because I was listening to a piece you did with Michael Rosen, and you said that with a master communicator, there's a lot of silence. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Now we're going to speak to our resident poet, Audrey Arden Jones, about silence and the place of silence. She did a PhD in it, so she's quite well placed to talk about the role of silence. From a broadcasting perspective, I've always been taught that silence is your enemy. You can't have dead air time. You've got to keep it going. You've got to keep people talking. You've got to, what's going to happen is the station tape going to kick in because it's detected too much silence. So silence is my enemy in a sense. But in a tender conversation, tell me how silence is my friend.
So when you think about thinking, when you think about doing that work inside you where you're turning over all these different, almost imponderable possibilities of how your situation might play out, the person who's doing that thinking is in a really intense place. Their concentration is very, very focused. And they're doing the work of starting to understand the dilemma or starting to reach towards possible solutions. And if we carry on talking at them, we interrupt the work that they are doing. And yet, of course, in the same way as you can't have radio silence, during COVID, most of these conversations weren't face-to-face. We weren't sitting in a room with a sick person or with their relatives and a cup of tea and a box of tissues, able to just, with our body language, show that we are remaining attentive. We had to find ways of doing that on the phone. And, you don't even know that the line is still attached if there is complete silence. So there are things we can do that say I'm still here, but don't call the person out of their silent place of contemplation. So just to be saying things like, this is really hard. I'm sorry this hurts so much. I'm still here. Take your time. Gosh, this is loads to think about, isn't it? They're compassionate, short statements of presence that don't require them to think about what you're saying. They are simply signals that you are still there. And so, in a way, they're still silence as far as the person who's doing their thinking is concerned. They're not calling them out of their place of contemplation back to your agenda. So, silence is the place where the work happens. Silence is the place where we make our minds up about things. Silence is the place where we change our minds about things. It's a really important part of the conversation. And what's very interesting is when you videotape consultations, and we do that quite a lot when people are learning their communication skills, young healthcare professionals, for example. They'll come out of the taping session and they'll say, "Oh, that silence took forever. Oh, that was awful." And then the other person will come out and say, "Well, that was really helpful. What about that really long silence? What really long silence?" And of course, it wasn't silent for them because they were busy in their head doing the work that the silence gave them.
That's fascinating. Because silence, I suppose I had it in my head that positive silence is quite visual. So those excellent tips you gave about, filling silence in a non-intrusive way on the phone or in an audio conversation where you can't see the face. You often hear that phrase, don't you? Oh, that's a bit awkward. That's an awkward silence or a difficult silence or, oh, why have they gone silent all of a sudden? But actually, you can just use your face if you're not covered in PPE. I mean, we've talked about that before, haven't we? Silence can be made more comfortable or made to feel important for the person that you're talking to visually, can't it?
It absolutely can. And one of the things that I learned a lot about during COVID, I was invited to help make some unwelcome news training materials for NHS staff. And that was a really fascinating thing to do. But we got huge help from Professor Ruth Parry and her team of academics at Loughborough University, who are conversation analysts. And all this stuff about conversation that you kind of know, but you didn't know that you knew. For example, that we seem to be primed as animals to communicate by conversation, taking turns. And from being babies, if we make a babbly noise at a baby will make a babbly noise back at us. And then it stops and waits for us to do it again. And they know about taking turns. Amazing. So one of the things about conversations analysis is not just the words that we use and the silences that we leave, but the other behaviours that help or get in the way of the conversation. And one of those is the way we look at each other. So in a conversation where we're taking turns, some of the time we're looking at each other, but a lot of the time we're not. We're looking away into the middle distance while we think our thoughts. And we get very hung up on gaze, somehow we have to be in direct eye contact in order to have a deeply meaningful conversation. And yet, I bet you know, and I certainly know from my family experience, that some of our most deep conversations have been in the car when the driver cannot possibly give you deep eye gaze because that's just not safe. Or when you're out walking with somebody side by side, and if you're not going to fall over, you really need to look where you're going. So giving attention is signalled by gaze, but it doesn't have to be intense eye lock gaze. But one of the things that we do is we signal to each other that it's your turn now. So I finish my kind of rambling monologue and I fall silent but I'm still looking downwards, and you know that I'm still thinking and I haven't finished yet. Or I finish my rambling monologue and I fall silent, and then I look at you, and that's a signal that it's your turn now. And it gets even more complicated than that, because you might even think, she's still sitting on something there. So you now gaze downwards to say, I defer my go. And I might now say something more that expands on the monologue that I took in my previous turn. So it's like a very, very complicated card game where we're giving each other cards, exchanging cards, or choosing to keep the cards and stick or twist. It's fascinating reading the research.
You got me a bit worried now. I hope the boffins at Loughborough University aren't marking me for my conversing skills with you now. They might be. I might be making some classic errors. Who knows?
Well, what's beautiful about what they do is they take feedback from the participants at the end of the conversation about how much the person felt that they were listened to, kept safe, dealt with compassionately, had things that they wanted to address properly addressed. And then what they'll do is go through the conversation to see what are the things that correlate with those positive outcomes. Or if the person felt that they weren't held in compassion, can you see where in the conversation the dip happened that they perceived as a lack of compassion? So it's all about helping to build up the behaviours of good listening. And again, they've got beautiful things on their training site that include how you repair after a rupture, that actually it's a stronger relationship if you make a mistake, apologise for the mistake, are not trying to make yourself better, but make the situation better. Actually, that builds the person's trust in you as a person who's safe to talk to and who's got their well-being at heart. So it's really, really interesting that what the research shows very much it chimes with your inner understanding of the people you like to talk to and feel safe with, and the people you wouldn't tell your secrets to for reasons that you've never really fathomed. But when you read this research, you realise what they do are those behaviours that don't help you to feel safe.
Yeah, and that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier, wasn't it? With the missteps and the. I like what you say actually about the just sort of kind of being honest about it, having the humility to be like, okay, I didn't quite say that as I wanted to. Sorry about that. What I really meant. I mean, I wouldn't do it like that. That sounds terribly stilted, but still, it is that sort of having a bit of self accountability, I suppose, a bit of humility, a little bit of the, being able to say, actually, I got it wrong. It's not a perfect conversation in that sense, and I got it wrong. So I love that about the way you do that, because there are ways of saying sorry, aren't there, as well, of course. You can do it in a way that seems like you're perhaps trying to make yourself feel better, as you say, or genuinely, well, I didn't want to put you in a more distressed position through my words when all I was trying to do was, So that's delicate, isn't it? The art of the apology is quite a delicate one.
Yeah, but isn't it all about the humility that comes with it? I think you're right. Humility is the right word, and just to be able to say to somebody, do you know what? I've just got this awful feeling that I just said something. I'm not even sure what it was that I said. That's hurt you. That's made this worse. That's taken us 3 steps backwards. And I'm really sorry. If you know what it is, can we talk about that? How can I
because their
take that
tone
back?
changes, doesn't
Yeah.
it? You sort of always have, I think, a little bit of an inkling you might have taken it down the wrong path. But then it's when the person straightens a bit, maybe, or puts a quizzical look on their face, or starts to talk to you in a more monotone, direct way, and you think, oh, this was very compassionate and an exchange, and it was nice, and now it isn't anymore. So I feel I have kind of made a misstep. So there are, again, it's those visual indicators, isn't it? You can work out where you've gone wrong, certainly if you can see someone's face, because you can start to try and work out where the conversation's gone.
Exactly so. And because we like to be polite to each other, if you say, oh, did I say something wrong? They'll say, oh, no.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Whereas if you say, I can feel that I just said something that wasn't the best thing to say. I don't know what it was. I'm really sorry. Help me understand. We were talking about this, and now suddenly I can feel that you seem a bit uncomfortable. I'm really sorry, whatever I did. Can we go back to this bit and take it from there? And that's like a dance, isn't it? Let's go back to when we were both standing up, reset the music, and let's keep going. Something we always do in a cognitive therapy session that I found appalling when I was first trained because it was so frightening, but which is absolutely the key to building the cognitive therapy therapeutic bond between the therapist and their client, is at the end of every session to say, okay, so that our therapy becomes the best it can be for you that I can give, please tell me now what worked well for you in this session and what you didn't like, so that next time we'll do more of what you found helpful and useful, and I can do less of the things you didn't like, or find different ways of going around the things that you find more difficult.
Is this the verbal version of the dreaded evaluation
It
form?
kind of is, but because you do it with every single session, you're gradually building a conversation with this person that is increasingly deliberately crafted to work the way they like conversations to work. Now, sometimes therapeutically, you need to offer people challenge as well, but now you're going to do that by saying, it's interesting that your preference is very strongly that we always encounter this issue in this particular way. And I'm interested that you find it particularly challenging if we try and look at it this other way. And I'm interested in what it is that's challenging about that. So rather than I'm going to do it that way just to see what happens, collaboratively, I'm asking permission to go there in a different way.
But then I suppose the quality of that, though, for that to be a really good process, for you to actually learn from whatever they say, you've almost had to have a good hour, haven't you, or a good 40 minutes, or whatever the session is. It has to have been relatively productive for them to feel comfortable in potentially criticising you.
Yeah. And so always we need to offer people the opportunity to give us feedback, even if it's just those little punctuations through a short conversation about, have I got that right? Please tell me if I'm getting this wrong. And if we offer it as, I might have got this wrong, it's far easier for a person to say, well, yeah, maybe it was okay, but that bit there, maybe. Whereas if you say, have I got it right? Have I understood you? You're asking them to say yes.
That's true. Yeah, very good point. Now, what I love about you, actually, and I don't want this to be a total love-in. I mean, I'm sort of letting my admiration for you come forth a bit too much, perhaps. But I love the way you do broach those things, that honesty in looking at where things could go better, and the lovely tone you always have. I think tone is so important. That you get away with a few missteps if you genuinely come across, as if you care, because you do, obviously. And I think a lot of people listening to the Art of Dying Well podcast, I mean, much as I think our conversation today has underpinned this throughout, are going to be asking that question, how do I break bad news? So without pushing you towards the toolkit you did not want this to become, what would you say to people that are specifically struggling with that, either how do I break bad news or how do I talk to someone who's had bad news broken to them?
Yeah. And so the first thing to notice is the reason that we feel awkward about it is because we know it matters. So it's not that we don't want to talk about it because we don't care. It's because we do care. So first of all, give yourself a point for caring enough to want to do it well. And then I'm thinking we'll have listeners who are ill and need to tell their families about the illness and they don't want people to be sad. We'll have listeners who are worried about the well-being of relatives or changes that they've seen in those people, maybe physical changes or maybe memory or emotional changes, and they want to try and find out more, but they're worried that it might be perceived as prying or unwelcome attention. So all of the reasons that stop us from stepping forward are about concern and love. And that's okay. So let's just recognize that before we start. mostly because we're talking about people who we are in relationship with. Issuing the invitation is probably the best place to start. So, next time your dad has a really forgetty moment, to then say, Dad, you've had a few forgetty moments recently. Is that something you would like to talk about sometime? Doesn't have to be now, but I just wonder whether it worries you a bit. And, that might be, do you know what? I'm not worried about me forgetting. Your mother's even worse. Or, no, no. That they're not ready to go there yet. So because it's an invitation, they do have the right to say no as well as to accept the invitation, and we have to accept that. Or to be able to say to the family that I have some news to tell you. When would be a good time for us to sit down together to do that? And if the family already know that you've been having tests or you were treated for a really serious illness a few years ago and everybody hoped it was over, they will immediately feel concerned and they will try to make themselves available as much as they can, as soon as they can. So those are things to think about issuing the invitation. One of the things I get a lot of questions about is adult children wanting to know what their parents or people that they have kind of responsibility towards, older relatives, want or don't want in terms of healthcare in the future. And they can't get into that conversation because the older adult doesn't want to talk about that or feels that it's intrusive to be asked about that or whatever else is going on. And one of the ways that I've learned from people who've done this successfully is that if we try to kind of parent our older relatives, now come on, Mum, we need to talk about this. That's not going anywhere, is it? That's really undermining who she is. She is an adult in her own right and has had parental or, aunt looking after duties with regard to you for much of your life. So it's very undermining if we start to take over. But what we can do is go back into that valued relationship of you are an older, wiser person who's always looked out for me, and take it that way. So I'm worrying about something and it's causing me a lot of concern. Sometimes I even wake up in the middle of the night worrying about it. And I'd really like to be able to talk to you about it. Now, nobody who has a caring concern for you is going to turn that request down. And the request doesn't have to be, I want you to write out your advance plan for your end-of-life care. The request is something as simple as, because I'm your closest relative, or because I'm the relative who lives closest to the hospital you'd get taken to if you were really sick, or because my phone number is in the doctor's notes or whatever, I just really worry that if something happened and you got really sick and the doctors couldn't get your opinion from you and they turned to me to say, what would you want? I just don't know what to say because you and I have never talked about it. I could make some guesses, but I'm really worried that I might be wrong. How would you feel about us just taking 10, 15 minutes to mull that over, just so I've got some kind of guide in case that ever happens? And then I can stop worrying about it and sleep, and you will know that I'll have your back if I ever need to speak for you.
Oh, that's superb. Some really good advice there. Lots of wisdom. The book is full of it, I must say. We haven't really gone into any of those specific stories. And I know the stories are illustrative, of course, some truth and some protecting people, of course, with names and other such things. But there's lots of things I hadn't considered in the art of conversation in many ways. And I think the thing we're all aware of, but don't really talk about, is the voice within. Now, you've got a section on that, actually, and I found that absolutely fascinating, not just because it chided with me in many personal ways as well, but it is that inner guide, isn't it? The voice we hear. Is it a lifeline or can it lead us astray, as you say in the book? But you also do say that listening to that voice is essential for our well-being. So probably it's important that we at least understand it a bit better and understand maybe when not to listen to it, or understand where it's guiding us, and what are those push points that are, informing that voice at that time, I suppose. And I really loved your sort of deconstruction of what the voice within is telling us. And in this specific case, what the voice within was telling a young man called Christy, cystic fibrosis sufferer, 17 years old, and his relationship with his mum. I thought that was, beautiful, but I totally understand where he was coming from. He'd made some judgments, hadn't he? He decided that his mum must hate him because of this behaviour and that behaviour, and look what my poor mum is dealing with. She must feel like this. She must feel like that. And I loved, tell us, because it's better in your words than mine. You sort of produced this piece of paper, put it into columns. Let's have the statement. Let's have some evidence for that statement and see whether this is actually true. Is this inner voice telling us the truth or not? Tell us a bit about Christy.
So Christy was a young man with cystic fibrosis who had not really flourished in school, because whilst his friends were all getting ready to go to university, he couldn't see the point in that, because he knew he was unlikely to survive as long as his 30th birthday. And so what was the point in doing all that swatting and trying to get a good job or trying to get a degree? Everything just felt a little bit pointless and difficult for him. But he loved music, and in particular he loved rap music. And Dizzy Rascal was a big hero of his. So this is going back a little while. And his mum really hated rap music and really particularly disapproved of Dizzy Rascal, who'd done time in prison for bad behaviours and things like that. So I don't think she thought that this was an appropriate role model for her beloved and only child. So he saw himself as a person who was responsible for his mum's woes, that his dad hadn't been able to work out how to look after a baby who was so sick and had left the marriage. So his mum was a single parent and was doing her best, but it's all my fault that dad left, because, if I'd been a better baby, then he wouldn't have gone. So he had all of these ideas in his head that everything that was difficult for his mum was his fault, and in some way that he was directly responsible for it. So as he's telling me all of this, I can hear that what he's doing is making loads and loads of assumptions. But if you try to tell somebody that they're making loads and loads of assumptions, they will tell you to back off, because they know what they think. So this is a way of helping us to listen to the voice that's in our head, that sometimes can be really good, encouraging voice, but sometimes can be a really bruising, belittling voice. So on this piece of paper, I just wrote down some of the things he said. So the first one that I wrote down is Dizzy Rascal is amazing, because that's what he'd said to me. And the next one I wrote down was that Mum hates Dizzy Rascal, because that was something else he'd said. And then I wrote some of the things that he'd said about his mum down. And then I asked him to start to look for some evidence for those first things. So what's the evidence that Dizzy Rascal is amazing? Not just what you think, but what's the actual hard evidence? And so he tells me all about his great rap and his rhythm style, and he's been in gang wars, he's been stabbed and was sick enough to die, but he recovered, and he's got these chart successes. So he's got some, fairly compelling real world evidence that this is a fairly remarkable individual, whatever you think about his music. And then what was his evidence that Mum hates Dizzy Rascal? So he tells me, well, she calls it a racket, and that's not nice music, and she says he's a thug. So again, he's got evidence. So then the other things that I wrote down were that he said, I think my mum must hate me, and I've ruined her life, so I don't blame her for hating me. And why wouldn't she hate me? I'm a real bastard to her. So I wrote these things down, and then I said, okay, so we're going to look for evidence for these things. Now he's got the idea. So actually, we're not just going to have loose evidence now. We're going to have very specific evidence. We're going to have evidence for what you've said and evidence against what you've said. So like putting the thought on trial in court. So here I've written here, Mum must hate me. What's your evidence for that? And there was a very long silence. So, well, is there any evidence that she doesn't hate you? And then he started to talk about how she's naggy, but she's naggy because she's worrying about me and she's trying to keep me safe. And she doesn't like the rap, but she lets me play it in my room. She puts up with the noise. And when my auntie says that I should get off my backside and get a job, she sticks up for me to my auntie. And she's desperate for me to get a lung transplant. And, we'd been discussing that if you really hated somebody, the sooner they would die, maybe the better. So getting a lung transplant doesn't sound like that kind of option. So what he's given me is really some fairly compelling evidence against his belief that his mum must hate him. So let's think about this belief that you've ruined your mum's life then. And he now started with the against evidence because he's got it, because he's a bright person. He said, well, she's already said that even if she'd known I had cystic fibrosis, she would have had me anyway. She wouldn't have not wanted me to be born. And the cystic fibrosis isn't my fault. That's a gene that I got from my mum and dad. And dad deciding to leave, that's not my fault either. He was a waster. He didn't have the energy for it. That's his fault. He let us down. That wasn't my fault. I was too little. And then he pointed to the evidence for I've ruined my mum's life. He said, she's lonely. And then evidence against, as he's thinking about his mum being lonely, she's lonely because she's a single parent and her husband is left, but actually she's with him against the world. And he said, and so she loves me. So we ended up with this piece of paper that had his beliefs on it, and then the things that popped into his head that supported those beliefs, which were the evidence for. So I'm a real bastard to my mum. His evidence for was that I'm mean to her. I stay out. I don't tell her where I'm going. I don't take my medicines before my meals, so my digestion doesn't work properly. And when I get really cross with her, I tell her she's a cow. So, okay, you're not always marvellous to her, are you? But is there any evidence against you just being a complete bastard to her? And then he told me this story that she'd run out of washing powder and she wanted to do the laundry, and she asked him if he'd go on his bike to get some laundry powder. And he did. He said, and it was raining and my hair got wet, and he had big hair. So his hair would have been completely out of control once it was wet. And he'd done that. He'd taken that for her because that was what she needed. And then he talked about, he makes her cups of coffee and I help with the housework. And there's a bit, well, not very often really, well, could do more. And it was just so lovely listening to him working it out, and that he'd written a birthday rap for her and performed it for her, and all these touching things about how much he actually loved her and showed his love. So yes, sometimes he was horrible to her. He's a teenager, but his brain wasn't showing him the whole truth. It was giving him just little bits of the truth. And when he sat down and thought about it, he could see the thoughts that didn't immediately leap to mind, but that were there. And we all do that. And we all do it about ourselves, and we do it about other people, and we do it about the world, and we do it about the future. And we also do it in a way that matches the emotions we have at the time. So, when you get up in the morning and it's a beautiful day and you've got time to have a leisurely breakfast and get yourself to work or to school or whatever, and you realise that your life is marvellous. And then the next day you oversleep and it's raining and somebody's parked you in, or you can't find the keys to your bike lock, and then every set of traffic lights is red and your life is just a disaster. And what's happening is the thoughts we can easily access are those that are promoted by the mood that we're in at the time. So in a day when we're feeling good, we notice good stuff and we have access to good thoughts. And on a day when we're feeling bad, we have access to all the bad stuff, the difficult memories, and noticing the difficulties in our circumstances. But when we look, both sets of things are there. and we're only giving attention to one of them. It's an attention bias, and it's a lovely thing to teach people to notice because it sets them free.
Oh, absolutely wonderful. Now, I think I told you we'd only be half an hour, didn't I, at the start of this? I've doubled up. I offer no apology for it because I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed it very much. There's lots more we could have talked about. The book is packed full of wisdom, packed full of charm, lovely stories. I think you're such a good storyteller, and it's a really good way of getting that teaching out, actually. Much as I know you don't want it to be specifically a toolkit, but I'm sure it will help lots and lots of people. I shall hold it up, even though it might be mirrored the other way, of course. Listen, How to Find Words for Tender Conversations. I found it very useful. I know everybody out there will find it useful. What's the next one? What's the next book?
I'm thinking about that.
You're allowed time and silence and space to consider it, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Kathryn, thank you so much, as always. A good friend of The Art of Dying Well, always there when we ask you, and I know you're very busy. So it's been a pleasure. Lovely to see you, and thank you very much.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you very much. Thanks, James.